Today we're going to talk about why it is so hard to see God in our regular lives. This is something I've been really interested in, and today I want to talk about this incredible insight that we get from science about physical blindness that helps us understand why it's so hard to see God. Let's begin with a true story of a blind man named SB who was 50 years old in 1963. So soon, SB will be waking up from the surgery that he never thought would be possible. Blind since birth, SB is getting a cornea transplant that will return his sight. Now, to be fair, SB would say that life hadn't actually been that bad. Sure, he never got to see a sunset or the faces of his friends. He couldn't drive or watch a movie, but he felt really grateful to live pretty independent and happy. He liked gardening and woodworking and even taking long bike rides with his hand on the shoulder of a friend. And now, as the doctors prepped him for surgery, he started wondering, what would it be like? They said they could fully fix his eyes. What would he see? What would the colors and shapes of the world be like? Would he know a tree when he saw one? Would he be able to take a hammer and hit a nail right on the head? What would it be like to see his own face? SB and the doctors were excited for this new surgery and his new sight, obviously. But afterwards, as SB healed from his surgery, the world was not the intelligible, beautiful, clear experience he'd been waiting for, that his doctors thought he'd see. The doctors examined his eyes and everything looked good, healthy, but SB couldn't really see, at least not in the way that most people do. SB's eyes, they worked, but his brain did not understand the messages his eyes were sending. It's like he heard the surgeon's voice and turned, but he only saw a blur of shapes, and he knew that voices came from faces and that he must be looking at a face, but it was nothing coherent. His brain didn't understand what his eyes were seeing at all. And so his doctors actually took SB later to a museum of technology and science because SB loved tools and science, and so they thought maybe this could help. Maybe if it was something that he really cared about, his brain and eyes could communicate better. They stopped at one machine and asked SB to tell them what it was just by looking. And he became obviously upset and said nothing at first. Eventually, he admitted that he couldn't see what it was. He couldn't even tell where the handle was. So he went close enough to run his hands over it and shut his eyes really tight. Then he stepped back and he said these words, "Now I've felt it. I can see it. Now I felt it, I can see it." See, it turns out that the surgery to heal the eyes of someone who's been blind since birth isn't even half of what a person needs in order to see. There's learning and processing that has to happen for the brain to understand what the eyes are bringing in. Now we have a technical term for this, visual agnosia. And your vision works correctly with this, but your brain can't compute. And so suddenly getting eyes that work is confusing and really disorienting. For example, just think about depth perception or the idea of stereo vision, the fact that you have two eyes and your brain is combining what they both see. Things you have to learn through experience. For the rest of his life, SB experienced slow and kind of limited success seeing with his now perfectly healthy eyes. And he's not alone in his experience. As medicine has developed and many people born blind have had similar surgeries, scientists are learning how challenging it is for the brain to learn how to see. In our spiritual lives, we experience this too. Seeing God in the world around us is difficult. Even when our spiritual eyes have healed and we're given sight, meaning even when we say, yes, I believe in God, I want to follow Jesus, our brains can't completely compute. I bet all of us, if we're honest, have felt that it is hard to see God in our lives at times. Do you ever feel like you're looking at your life and you can't tell if you are seeing God or not? Have you ever asked God if he's there, asked for a sign that you can understand? If God is real, why can't I see him? Why isn't it so clear that God is here? There's this verse in the Bible that says, "Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand." God is right here all around us, and we just don't know how to compute what we are seeing because we were spiritually blind and our brains haven't learned how to process our spiritual sight. How we see God, it affects everything in our lives, from our attitudes to our motives to our actions and opinions. It will affect who you marry and how you do your job, what you do with your time and money, everything. What if we are like people born blind and God is here, seeing all of life clearly, wanting to help us learn to see, taking us to the museum in some ways, showing us new truths that are all around us. And it's just slow going. Our depth perception is off. We don't know what we're looking at. What did SB say? Now that I've felt it, I can see it. Once he felt it, his brain understood a little better. That's what we are here to do at the crossing. Get our hands on some moments where we can feel the real truth around us so we can see better. And honestly, this will take humility for us. We have to be willing to admit that we cannot see. I think about that moment with SB the day in the museum when he had to admit he couldn't see the tools right in front of him. So our first step in learning to see is admitting to ourselves and God that we cannot. God, I don't see. Please help. Humbling ourselves before God allows him to start helping us. In James 4:10, in the King James Version, it says it this way: "Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up." Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord. God sees clearly. Admitting to him and to ourselves that we do not. That's our first step. Because when we are honest, we know that we only see things as we are, not as they are. We see only from our own perspective, but we can allow God to train us to see more clearly. There's a theme in the last day of Jesus' life. So many people are there looking right at him and not understanding what they are seeing. They don't realize that they're not seeing him as he is. They're seeing him through their own perspective. And their perspective is like a person who was spiritually blind since birth and can't recognize what they're looking at. In particular, we are going to meet 3 different people who come face to face with Jesus and simply cannot understand what they're seeing in him because they are focused on the wrong things. And here's the fun part. As we witness their moments with Jesus, we get a precious chance to get a good look at our own misconceptions. We will call them blind spots when it comes to seeing the spiritual side of life. These are skills that we can develop so we can learn to see God in our lives and learn to see life from God's perspective. So first, in Luke 23 is where we will start today. First, we meet a man named Pilate. Pilate is a Roman prefect, a governor of Judea. His job is to keep order. He is the head of the Roman government for this assigned area. So he collected taxes, he enforced laws, he oversaw the city. His spiritual blind spot is that he focuses on control over curiosity. So this first spiritual blind spot is when we focus on control over curiosity. This is going to sound weird, but I find this man incredibly relatable. I know I am not a Roman governor, but hear me out. Do you remember the first time you realized that you were the adult in a situation? I will never forget the first time I realized I was the mom, I was the parent. So there was a time that my husband and our toddler both had stomach flu. But I only had strep throat. So my husband was in our room so sick. Our toddler had just gotten sick for, I think, the 3rd time that night, and I had just finished changing all the bedding again. I finally got our toddler to sleep a little. It's 2 a.m. I know it's not going to last long. I softly closed the door behind me, and I just stand there with my fever and my sore throat, and I thought, oh no, I am the mom in this situation. No one is coming to save me. I'm the one taking care of this situation until it is all the way done. You ever been there? Okay, Pilate is the one taking care of the situation until it is all the way done. Pilate is the guy who's been grinding at work for years. Sure, the pay is good, but he's exhausted. He gets up at dawn to handle the issues of the day, and there are always issues. So of course he wants order and control and to have everyone just behave. He's balancing pressures from his bosses, from his employees, from the whole city. And on this morning, he wakes at the crack of dawn to hear the complaints of the Jewish leaders about a man claiming to be the king of the Jews. And they tell Pilate that Jesus opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, the king. And in the Roman Empire, this is punishable by death if proven. So Pilate, doing his job, looks at Jesus and asks him directly, "Are you the king of the Jews?" It's straightforward. And Jesus takes his time answering. "You have said so," Jesus replied. I mean, who is this guy? You have said so? Pilate is just doing his job, keeping order, ruling for Rome, just trying to get through his day with some semblance of order. He can't see the fullness of who Jesus is because Jesus definitely doesn't fit in his controlled box and because his focus is on control. Pilate does not follow any curiosity. There's a little spark there, but he doesn't follow it. He's completely uninterested in God. He's interested in control. He's like many of us. Many of us are uninterested in God at times. If you're watching this, you probably have some interest in God, but many of us are uninterested in God and are just focused on controlling our own lives until once in a while we get these little glimpses of something spiritual or weirdly meaningful, but we don't know what to make of them. Like maybe you hear a song or you see a movie that just, it moves you to tears. Like there's something beautiful even beyond the physical in it. But then you get it together and move on, right? Or maybe there's a serious situation. Maybe your dad gets sick and you visit him in the hospital and he says he loves you for the first time in 20 years, which makes you very worried. And you find yourself saying a quick prayer in the car on the way home, like, "God, just please let him be okay." And then you kind of almost laugh at yourself because who are you to pray? You don't pray. Maybe you go to Yosemite for a weekend and you have the fleeting thought that you hadn't had before. Something like, "Wow, God is amazing." What? What made you think about God? And then you shake all that off and you go back to life as usual, right? Just focus. Work too much, buy stuff, indulge in stuff, work again, control. When those moments with the divine come up, we don't stay with it. We don't ask it questions. We don't feel it so we can see it, right? We don't want to let go of control and let the divine mess up our carefully balanced life. Pilate has no interest or ability to fully see Jesus in front of him. Pilate helps us ask ourselves things like, will we focus more on curiosity when that weird little thought about God comes up? Will we ask questions? Will we stay in it with Jesus, even if it disrupts our lives? Because starting to really see God, it does disrupt your life, right? Pilate, he doesn't want to kill Jesus. He just doesn't want to deal with him. That's how many people feel. I don't hate Jesus. I just don't want to get involved with all that. And so Pilate turns to the crowd and the chief priests and he says, "I find no basis for a charge against this man. He's not a threat to Rome." But they insist that he has been stirring people to riots against Rome all over Judea, starting in Galilee. And Pilate says, "Wait, what? He's from Galilee." Great, okay. Because if Jesus is from Galilee, then he is actually someone else's problem. And that someone happens to be in town. Which brings us to our second person, Herod Antipas. King Herod, this is not the one who is trying to kill baby Jesus. This is the one who beheaded John the Baptist because he insulted his new wife. So this Herod, he is in Jerusalem and he happens to be just around the block. So Pilate sends Jesus to him. Herod is a Jewish king, a tetrarch they're called, of a small area that includes the city called Galilee. Now, his family is allowed to rule under Rome's guidance because they were willing to live by Rome's rules. His job is similar to Pilate, but he seems much less stressed about it. Herod represents our next blind spot. Spiritual blind spots. Another one, when we focus on entertainment over enlightenment. Herod loves a party. He is thrilled to have Jesus his way. He's been wanting Jesus to come and perform miracles for him forever. This is like the event of the season. It's arrived. Give me miracles. Give me emotional experiences. So Jesus is brought to him, and Herod asks him questions, and Jesus says nothing. He asks more questions. Jesus does nothing, gives nothing. And Herod is furious. Herod wanted to be entertained. He's not interested in seeing God as he really is. He's not interested in enlightenment or learning to see differently. He only wants Jesus there to give him what he wants. Have you ever come to church and you leave with kind of a sense of like, didn't really feel it today. Music was just okay, message was boring, didn't really entertain me. Do you ever feel like you don't know what God's doing? You really thought exploring faith would mean you'd have endless adventures where you feel like a conqueror. You'd see miracles all day, every day. But you just don't have that like God is near vibe anymore. And over time, maybe you get a little mad about your faith feeling flat. Herod and his soldiers get mad when Jesus won't entertain them. And we do this in our faith, with our church. God isn't entertaining me. We can't see what we want to see. We get angry. We lash out at our church, at our pastors, at God. God isn't entertaining us, so we get rid of him. If God isn't going to give me what I want, I don't want God. And so Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate. Pilate says, come on, I can't get rid of this guy. Neither Herod nor Pilate find anything worth killing Jesus over. But the crowd wants him dead. And Pilate decides the only thing that will allow him to keep control is to give Jesus back to the crowd. And that is what so many of us do. We don't know what to do with Jesus, so we just give up on him. Did you know that many people who are born blind and then they have these surgeries to restore their sight, over time they actually give up on trying to live like a seeing person because it's too disorienting and too scary. They cover their eyes and they stop trying to learn to see. There was one doctor who studied 66 cases and put it this way. A patient waking from surgery does not see the world as filled with the gifts of intelligible light and color. The project of learning to see inevitably leads to a psychological crisis in the life of the patients who may wind up rejecting sight. New impressions threaten the security of a world previously built upon the sensations of touch and hearing. Some decide it is better to be blind in their own world than sighted in an alien one. And so it is with our spiritual blindness. We have a real choice. Do we keep trying to see, or do we go back to our old version of life? When we get those glimpses of the divine, when we have moments where we almost see God, we have these tiny choices. Will we stay curious? When God doesn't do what we want, doesn't entertain us, will we let ourselves change and be enlightened? Or will we decide it is better to be blind in our own world than weirdly sighted in God's? But there's one man who, even when his vision of God was off, he stayed with it. He kept trying, because this learning is lifelong. This man's name, our third man, his name is Peter. He is one of Jesus' disciples, the wildest, most stubborn one. And we'll go to Luke 22 to discover his blind spot. His spiritual blind spot, it's when we focus on fixed over fuller and fuller images of God. Peter is stubborn and single-minded. Once Peter gets something in his head, it takes a lot for him to learn to see it differently. He's a great example for us because he is definitely learning to see. He often gets confused. But where he's different is he never gives up on Jesus. He never gives up on learning to see. If there's someone we can look to for inspiration and hope that gaining our spiritual sight is a process worth committing to, even when it's frustrating and confusing, Peter is it. So the night before Jesus meets with Pilate and Herod, he's at a dinner with his disciples. And on Good Friday, we're going to go into that dinner in a deep way. But today, we're just going to focus on this quick private conversation Jesus and Peter have. Jesus turns quietly to Peter, who is also known as Simon. And he says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. And Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. Jesus turns quietly at this dinner and says, don't give up. Tonight you're going to find a new challenge in how you see me. You've gotten comfortable with the fixed version of how you see me, but you're still not seeing me completely, and I need you to see a fuller picture of who I am. Because Jesus knew Peter could get focused on fixed ideas, not realizing that he still had a long way to go in understanding the fullness of spiritual things. So Jesus sets up a humbling opportunity for Peter so that God can lift him up on the other side and improve his sight. So after dinner, they go to the garden where Jesus likes to pray. And it's there that the soldiers and high priests come to arrest Jesus. Now, Peter doesn't hesitate. He takes out his sword and with his whole life force attacks a soldier, cutting off his ear. Jesus immediately says, "Enough of this," and stops Peter, returning the ear to the owner and healing him. And then Jesus lets himself be taken away. Now, one thing for us to notice in this story, Jesus does not need us to cut off the ears of his enemies. Peter has been learning to see Jesus for 3 years. He thinks he understands what he's seeing, but he's wrong. Jesus, he's not there to fight and overtake the government. He's not there to destroy his enemies. He's there to love his enemies, to win through sacrifice. And Peter is so confused by what he's looking at. This will happen in your faith. You will reach times when you thought you understood God. You thought you understood life, and then something will happen that will pull the rug out from under you. Be like Peter. Stay in it. Doubt is not the enemy. When we are confused by the spiritual things we're trying to see, remember that it is a chance for growth and a fuller and fuller image of God to reveal itself to your learning eyes. Jesus is taken to the home of the high priest in the middle of the night to wait for daybreak so they can go see Pilate. Peter has followed them at a distance, and he sits near a fire in the courtyard. He can see Jesus from where he sits. While he sits there, 3 different people accuse him of being one of Jesus' disciples. And as the third one asks if he's one of Jesus' people, this is what happens. Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And just as he's speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. And then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. Peter is so confused by what's happening, but he's looking at Jesus, trying to learn to see him fully. He's not giving up. It says Jesus turned and looked straight at Peter. Jesus can really see Peter completely. Peter is still learning to see him. He's having a moment like we will. It's described in 1 Corinthians like this. Now, we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror. But then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete, but then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely. We see things imperfectly. God knows us completely. Let that comfort you. There is one who can see us, sees all of life clearly. And because of that, we can learn to see fuller and fuller visions of this life. Presently, there is a professor from MIT, he's a specialist in vision and cognition, who is in the middle of an amazing project that we can learn something from. So he went to Delhi, India to visit family and met a child that was born blind. He learned that there are between 200 and 700,000 children born blind in India, and he wanted to do something about it. So he started a project called Prakash, and that was born, and he and his students have a hospital and a school where they do surgeries necessary to fix the eyes of kids between 6 years old and 20 years old. They've returned sight to over 500 kids. And because these are people who were blind but now have working eyes, and because there are hundreds of them, he's learning how our brains learn to see. These kids, they still have to learn to see with their healed eyes. It's still a process, but they're not rejecting their sight because the doctors now know what tools to give them that they need to train their brains. They have a school where they practice and practice and practice. They do art, they practice reading, they focus on faces. It's just like us at the crossing. We practice and practice and practice, seeing the world as full of God's presence. We go to church, we read the Bible together, we talk about what we are seeing, and we focus on Jesus. There's this verse in the Bible that is talking about Jesus, and it says this: the Son, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Jesus is our best way to see God. If you've seen Jesus, if you've read about Jesus, you have seen God. We cannot see God clearly, so God came as Jesus to show us an image we can start to understand. But it's not instant. It will take our whole lives to learn to see with more clarity and really understand. One final amazing thing. Those scientists in India saw that the kids had an especially hard time seeing faces. And they realized that it's because their eyes were healed so fast, so much faster than their brains could heal. So they give all the kids glasses that make their vision more like an infant so that their brain has time to catch up and develop in a more natural way. On the days when you're feeling frustrated that God is hard to see, remember that He needed to slow it down for our brains to understand what is all around us. So He speaks in parables. He makes things a little bit blurry. Our brains are catching up to our spiritual sight. So keep practicing. Stay in it. You have to feel it to see it. If you want to see more clearly, to recognize the movement of God as the movement of God in your life, to have eyes to see, I want to pray this one last verse for us. It says, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which He has called you, the riches of His glorious inheritance in His holy people. I pray that you will have eyes to see more and more of God, fuller and fuller pictures all around you. Can I pray for you that you can have sight to see God in your life? Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for our lives. Thank you for the metaphors that you build into the way you did creation. You give us this metaphor of physical sight and the different ways that we learn to see, and it allows us to better understand our spiritual sight. You give us these tangible things that help us see the spiritual. Thank you for that. And Lord, I just pray for anyone who watches this, anyone who is in this moment with me, that they would know that you are with them, that you love them, that you can see clearly, that doubt is not the enemy. It's okay to go slow. Just don't give up. Right now, it is hard to see. Someday we will see clearly, but in the meantime, you are with us and you are helping us learn where to focus so that we can start to see you better. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.